Hello, and welcome again to another Bible study about Jesus. This time we look at the identity of Jesus. Who is he? How do we recognize him? It's an important study, primarily because Jesus is important, but understanding who he is a great deal of that importance. He's the most important person to ever live on the earth, and we're going to see why. So grab your Bible and join me as we search the scriptures today. I'm Ben Perry Jr., and I'm glad you're here. What defines identity? We hear a lot about identity these days. We talk about who we are. We talk about identity theft. We talk about those kinds of things. And what really is identity? As humans, we try to find our identity in a lot of different ways. But some of the more common are we find our identity in power. We think we have to be powerful, more powerful than other people. That's how people recognize us. Or we have to have fame. Being famous is a way that some people are identified, but is that the real answer? How about riches? Some people have a lot less riches than they do other things. Jesus, for instance, didn't have any money. At least the Bible never records that he had any money. But he was rich. And of course, materialism, that's the things we have, our possessions, the material things of earth. We find our identity in those. We tend to come to a lot of conclusions about other people as well. Often those conclusions are wrong because we don't really know who they are. We haven't identified them well. Everything that Jesus did and everything he said points to his identity as the Messiah, the Christ. We start today in Luke chapter 9, verses 18 and 19. Luke records, and it happened that while Jesus was praying alone, the disciples were with him. And he questioned them, saying, "Who do the crowds say I am?" They answered and said, "John the Baptist. And others say Elijah. But others, that one of the prophets of old has arisen." Jesus knew the importance of private prayer. The Bible doesn't tell us how often he prayed alone, but it does on several occasions show us his private moments with the Father. I often wondered if there were times when his disciples interrupted those special times when he really needed to be just alone. I think they just didn't understand who he really was until after his resurrection. What are some of the ways people describe Jesus today? Many people in our age have misperceptions of Jesus' identity, so maybe we shouldn't be too hard on those disciples back then. At the time of this writing, or at the time of the writing exposes to us, Jesus was alone. He was praying. But his disciples were close by. Jesus is often seen in the Gospels, especially in Luke, praying. Now, what a lesson that is for us. If Jesus considered prayer important, how much more so should it be to us? His disciples were with him, which was just what they had been called to do. But we don't know what they were doing. They likely observed Jesus in prayer, but nothing indicates they participated with him or knew the content of his prayers. Now, we think of prayer as a religious exercise, primarily one focused on supplication or request to God. The word rendered prayer, however, comes from a compound Greek word that suggests holding oneself up before something or someone, being closely joined to that person or that thing. Therefore, prayer is coming before God, being joined closely to Him. It is communing with Him, conversing with Him, uniting with Him. Many times this means we need to be alone with the Father, having a private conversation without anybody else's input. We can only speculate the substance of Jesus' prayer. Perhaps it was his personal time of fellowship with the Father. No one could understand Jesus better than the Father. Jesus was devoted to his Father's will. He may have asked for guidance on how to proceed with his disciples and helping them understand who he is. His destiny with death was drawing near. Time was running out. How could he best prepare them for what was coming to take place in a few short months? For that, he may have sought his Father's counsel. What did Jesus want to know from the disciples? Well, we have the same opportunity to listen to what others say about Jesus. Excuse me. During his lifetime, people had lots of different ideas of who Jesus was. The disciples reported what they heard people saying about Jesus. Jesus, however, is more than a marvelous human being or a master teacher. Don't you wonder sometimes why we don't see who the real Jesus is? Moving on to verses 20 through 22, Luke writes, Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am? Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered and said, "The Christ of God." But he warned them and instructed them not to tell this to anyone, saying, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised on the third day." You see, this is something we need to understand. Jesus' identity is wrapped up in his death and his resurrection for us. Now, Peter identified Jesus as the Messiah. Old Testament prophets correctly understood. Old Testament prophecy, correctly understood, tells us that Jesus' Messiahship will be fulfilled at the second coming. It simply wasn't the correct time for the children of Israel to have the overthrow they longed for. If someone were to ask you, who is Jesus? How would you respond? Why is it important to have a personal understanding of who Jesus is? On this day, as on other occasions, one voice spoke up for the entire group. Peter answering said, "The Christ," or the Messiah of God. Perhaps the others expected Peter to speak for them, for he often was a spokesman. He was the aggressive one. He was persistent in his speech. He was persistent in his action. Maybe as he spoke, each man nodded in agreement. What a confession it was. Others may have considered Jesus to be a prophet, influential, but only a man. These men saw something more. Christ, or Messiah, they're interchangeable words, means anointed one. In this case, anointed of God, meaning by God and from God. He was the long-awaited one, anointed with power from on high, the promised one who was set apart by God to bring deliverance and to reign as king. It seems Jesus was pleased with this answer, even though what follows indicates they needed additional instruction. The disciples still believed in Jesus as the Messiah of Jewish hope and prophecy. It will become plain that they don't grasp the spiritual conception of the Messiah and his kingdom that Jesus taught. But they are clear that he is the Messiah, however faulty their view of the Messiah may be. Peter given the correct response. His confession used the right words. But did he and the others know what the words meant as applied to Jesus? Today, Peter's response seems obvious. Why was Peter's response such a big deal at that time? What does it mean for Jesus to be recognized as the Messiah? There were still things Jesus needed to do before being revealed as the Messiah. Let's look at his instructions to the disciples in verse 21 through 22. In verse 22, what three things did Jesus say would happen in the future? Well, he gave the first of three explicit announcements of his death and resurrection. There were three times during his earthly ministry that he told the disciples that he was going to die and be resurrected. In doing this, Jesus affirmed a radical concept of messiahship that was different than the normal understanding. His messiahship would be marked by humiliation, rejection, and suffering. But he also announced victory and exaltation, though it seems that this part of his message was overlooked by his disciples much of the time. The phrase Son of Man is Jesus' usual way of speaking of himself. It's rooted in the prophecies of Ezekiel, where it serves as a poetic synonym for man or human being, and the apocalyptic section of Daniel, where it's used to identify the glorious person who comes in the clouds to receive dominion and glory. Thus, the phrase captured the truth of his full humanity and his divine messianic mission, both of which are critical to a full understanding of who Jesus is. It's heresy to deny or minimize Jesus' divinity or his humanity. He was both, all at the same time. I don't understand it. I don't expect you to understand it. God hasn't given us that great ability to understand how a human being can be God and man at the same time, and yet Jesus was. That's one of those things we just have to accept by faith. But Jesus explained some things. He said the Son of Man must suffer many things. Now that word must, it declares divine necessity. In other words, it's what God ordained. What would unfold, despicable as it would be, still would be under God's control. Through the suffering of Jesus, God was bringing his redemptive plan and purpose to a completion. The events to come are described by four verbs. Most can be applied to each one. He must suffer, from a word that means to experience a sensation or impression, usually a painful one. The term can be associated with the paschal lamb of Passover, offered as an atonement for sin, or it may have connections with the concept of a suffering servant in passages like Isaiah 53. Many things suggest the scope and intensity of the suffering. And the Son of Man must be rejected. Rejected means disapproved or repudiated. Those doing so were elders. They were lay members of the Sanhedrin, if you will, the highest Jewish council, presided over by the high priest and the chief priest, members of high priestly families, including the high priest himself, and the scribes. They were the trained theologians of the day, charged to study, interpret, and transmit the law. The religious authorities repudiated Jesus because he posed a threat to their theology and personal interest. The Son of Man must be slain. Slain means to inflict mortal death, to destroy. It can be rendered killed. The repudiation by the religious authorities was more than verbal and emotional abuse. Their rejection reached the point of planning, supporting, and authorizing Jesus' death, and with absolutely no apology whatsoever. In verses 23 through 26, Luke writes, and he was saying to them all, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself. He must take up his cross daily, and he must follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake, this is the one who will save it. For what good does it do a person if he gains the whole world, but loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and the holy angels. So what does it mean to follow Jesus? What is the first thing Jesus says to his disciples? We'll respond to Jesus' identity by dying to self and following him. This is all part of salvation. We don't do it to win Jesus' approval. His approval is a nice thing to have, but we don't do it to win his approval so he can save us. We do it because he saves us, and we appreciate him. While those who follow Jesus truly are blessed, this wasn't the focus of his message in this setting. The disciples needed to know what lay before them. You do too. Jesus didn't sugarcoat what would be required of any who would choose to come after him. Let him deny himself, he said. This is not a call to a life of weakness or the lifestyle of a monk. It's a call to be strong and make wise choices. To confess Christ, to identify with him, calls for a radical decision to deny self, meaning refuse to set our desires and will above his. It is to live for his sake and not for our own. Too often the words take up his cross daily have been weakened by our applying those words to personal struggles or inconveniences. That's not your cross. We may say about some problem, this is just a cross I have to bear, but it's not your cross. The first disciples would have not heard it that way. They knew what a cross was. They knew it was an instrument of death. They also knew that one to be executed on a cross was expected to carry it to the place of execution. Note that Jesus bore his own cross to Golgotha. You can read about that in John 19:17. Even though he required the assistance of Simon of Cyrene. The walk to the place of death was a one-way journey. To take up suggests a voluntary action. Thus, to be Jesus' disciple means giving oneself completely to him with no turning back. This commitment was to be lived out daily, every day, no matter what might come. To follow Jesus meant to be in the same way, to walk the same road, to accompany. Of course, follow also implies coming after one who precedes another. We've all played follow the leader. We understand how that works, don't we? Jesus is first. We walk behind him. It's not easy. It's difficult. There's no room for a believer to be ashamed of identifying himself as a follower of Christ. So let's dig a little deeper here. Location can affect a lesson's impact. For instance, talking about the wonder of nature while at the Grand Canyon has a greater impact than when you're talking about it standing in your backyard. This is a location principle that's true of Peter's answer to Jesus' question. Jesus asked him, "But you, who do you say that I am?" And Peter responded, "God's Messiah." If we read Matthew 16 and Mark 7, we understand this conversation occurred at Caesarea Philippi. Now, I'm going to give you some information here in the next moment or two that really sheds some light on what Jesus said. Caesarea Philippi was a sanctuary site dedicated to the Greek fertility god called Pan, P-A-N. The most obvious geographical feature at that location is a stone cliff face that rises about 100 feet. At the base was a massive cave opening from which water came gushing forth. Ancient people believed the cave was the opening to the underworld called Hades. People came to this beautiful site to worship Pan and other mythological deities. Jesus' response to Peter's answer takes on significance due to the location. And let me just drop this in here for a moment. I don't think Jesus ever took a step that he didn't know where he was going and why he was going and the purpose for which he was going, and it was always to explain to his disciples and the crowd who he is. Matthew records that Jesus said, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you," the fact that I'm the Messiah, "but my Father in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock, the rock of your faith and of this truth, as opposed to the massive 100-foot rock standing before your eyes, I will build my church. And the gates of Hades," not even with this massive display of water gushing forth so powerfully, "will not overpower it." When I read this became such a revelation of how Jesus uses object lessons to teach us his reality, to help us to understand who he is. Not even this cave opening that was gushing water forth could overpower Peter's faith when it came to full fruition. Oh, by the way, a 19th century earthquake caused that cave to collapse. Water was diverted to another, smaller opening. Thus, the mythological gate of Hades was closed by Jesus' supernatural action. He does have power over the wind and the waves, doesn't he? So let's look at how to live out what we've learned. Here's your question. How will the truth that Jesus invites you to identify with him impact your life, starting today and for the rest of your life? Well, first of all, if you conclude that Jesus is the Son of God, it should lead you to do something with that truth. It means you should live like him and you should testify like him. Believers must boldly and accurately declare who Jesus is. We have to tell people who Jesus is. Paul's very clear about that in Romans when he writes that how will they hear without somebody to proclaim? There should be evidence in your life that indicates you're living for Jesus rather than yourself. That's how you identify with him. That there's evidence in your life that shows others you're living for him rather than for yourself. Well, next week. Crucifixion is one of the most barbaric forms of execution ever devised. And certainly, Jesus suffered both before and during his crucifixion. Come back next time and join me as we study from Luke chapter 23, verses 32 through 49, and relive the horror of that day that was necessary for our salvation.